B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, July 30th, 2018. My jingle singers are hopped up on Red Bull today. Let's see if we can slow them down just a little bit, guys. I mean, really. Whew, that's better. This is my final podcast for the next few weeks. I'm heading off on vacation to New England, and then as the remodeling of the Secret Studio progresses, I don't know exactly when I'll be able to resume podcasting, but look for me in the third week of August at all of the usual outlets. I lead the podcast today with an important note. Ro Khanna is a Democratic member of Congress from Silicon Valley, and when Ro Khanna first surfaced, I wasn't too happy about Ro Khanna because it took him 2 election cycles to knock off a sitting member of Congress who was doing a good job, in my opinion. The guy who lost to Ro Khanna is Mike Honda. He's now retired. And in his early years in Congress, Ro Khanna has distinguished himself as a thoughtful guy who is ready to propose some very progressive and important legislation. And he is the one who's responsible, 2 years running now, for an amendment to the Intelligence Authorization Act that would prohibit funds appropriated to be used to interfere in a democratic election of a foreign country, including by engaging in the hacking of foreign political parties, engaging in the hacking or manipulation of foreign electoral systems, or sponsoring or promoting media outside the United States that favors one candidate or party over another. And I want to credit James Cardin at The Nation, who interviewed Ro Khanna and brought this story forward. And I think it's important, even if you believe the Rachel Maddow Democratic Party-driven Russiagate narrative 100%, because it's hypocritical for us to sit here and accuse Russia of nefarious deeds, rigging our election, choosing Trump over Clinton, when it's widely known that we have interfered in over 80 non-American elections going back to the end of World War II. And of course, the most notable include Iran, Guatemala, so many countries. It's unfair to try to list them all. And Ro Khanna does buy into Russian interference. He and I don't agree on that. He says, of course, we are deeply offended that Russia interfered in our election. We should make it clear to the Russians we will not tolerate it in the future. At the same time, we should proactively take a position to not do the same to other countries. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard even if we are victims of Russia's harmful action. We should treat other countries the way we want to be treated. Isn't that the golden rule? He continues, by taking this bold stand, we would send a message to the world that this is the gold standard. America doesn't interfere in other countries' elections. A friendly amendment, Congressman? Anymore. So I take this very seriously. But the rest of the membership of Congress does not. Because Ro Khanna has tried and failed twice to amend bills to include this language, and there are only a handful of people who support him. Senator Feinstein from here in California, Jeff Merkley from Oregon, Ed Markey from Massachusetts, and Bernie Sanders. They support a cyber treaty, and I would certainly entertain that once we see the dimensions of it, if it is actually proposed. And I think this is so important to note, because while this hysterical drama has unfolded, and the outsized claims of Russian influence of the thinking of Americans with some wacky Facebook posts and some Twitter messages, well, even mainstream publications like the Los Angeles Times are raising questions. In an op-ed attributed to a Times writer, Virginia Heffernan, the headline reads, "Was the 2016 election legitimate? It's now definitely worth asking the question." Now, they too embrace the idea of Russia picking Trump, but they go on to note the interference in our election by Americans. And this, of course, is the point that I have been driving home, perhaps to the repetitive frustration of my loving listeners. But Heffernan writes, in Wisconsin, as Mother Jones has reported, discriminatory ID laws prevented 45,000 eligible voters from participating in the election, including 23,000 in 2 heavily Democratic counties, and Trump won the state by 22,000 votes. The Republican Attorney General of Wisconsin, Brad Schimmel, even recently boasted that Trump won Wisconsin chiefly because tens of thousands of eligible voters were turned away. And I don't agree with this comment here, but I'll read it. We've long known that Russian hackers attempted to break into the nation's voter databases. NBC reported this year they succeeded. Senior intelligence officials said that Russia compromised 7 states, including California, Florida, Illinois, and Texas. Now, I know they attempted to hack. We have seen no evidence that they did anything more than snoop around and look at some voter registration documents. And I do not try to undermine threats, both foreign and domestic, to the paltry defenses that we have for the cyber systems that we use in our elections. And if you haven't yet heard my recent interview with Bill Binney, the former NSA technical director, he once again describes how American security systems have been left intentionally vulnerable by snoops like the NSA to make it easier for them to hack into Americans' communications. And so we need to beef up our cybersecurity. But it's real simple, folks, and only a handful of people are talking about it at this late stage. It's 99 days to the November midterm elections. No one has made a move to shift to hand-counted paper ballots. And we're wringing our hands, and the Democrats try to appropriate money. Nobody really knows where the money would go to strengthen our cybersecurity. But let's cut the crap here. If you want an honest election, hand-counted at the precinct level paper ballots, with the tallies hand-carried to the election registrar, to the central tabulation zone, wherever that is in any given election district, that's how you avoid these issues of hacking. And when it comes to the voter rolls, there are many ways to protect that data that don't require like a PhD in electrical engineering. I also want to note a very strong piece published at Mint Press News over the weekend, and it is directed to one individual, Senator Sanders from Vermont. Bernie, it was your decision to speak against the consolidated graft that is cratering society, that captured the imagination of the disaffected and gave people hope that their voices could be heard above the cash extortion that dominates our government. Instead of continuing your rebellion against the establishment and speaking against the corrosive nature of our politics, you are charting a course toward irrelevance by jumping on this cockamamie Russiagate narrative. Here's what I don't get about your decision to glom onto this most ridiculous assertion that 12 Russians had more impact on our elections than the billions of dollars that are spent by corporations and plutocrats to bend elected officials like pretzels. The insinuation the punditry is making that Americans were duped to vote against their own self-interest because they refused to vote for Hillary Clinton. Never mind that Hillary was one of the most divisive, disliked politicians to run for president in modern American history. Never mind that the DNC essentially rigged the primaries to ensure her victory at your expense. Instead of focusing on the structural and systematic flaws that render our votes irrelevant, fingers are pointed at a manufactured villain halfway around the world in order to distract from the fact that our elections have been hijacked by moneyed interests and entrenched leeches who are sucking the citizenry dry. Whatever efforts Russia may have made to influence our elections were outweighed by a kleptocracy that hacked down our democracy with dark money and self-centered politicians who put their interests above that of the people they purportedly serve. Again, addressing Senator Sanders, you had the following and the prominence to make a dent in this wall of malfeasance that is drowning our governance and exacerbating social inequalities in the process. Sadly, instead of leading a revolution against a most insidious duopoly that has monopolized the ballot boxes and commandeered our government, you chose to cast your lot with the cackling warmonger from Chappaqua, who loves Wall Street as much as she craves power. Now, this continues for another page and a half. I have linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, and I encourage you to click on that and read it. It is attributed to Tewodros Fikri, founder and editor of the Guyana Journal, and that's the first I've heard of that individual. Meanwhile, our dear tweeter is at it again. Last week, he met with Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, and they had a plan. That they're going to sneak past the midterm elections by not forcing a vote on immigration or funding for Trump's wall. The deal lasted for 2 or 3 days. And Sunday, our dear tweeter got out his phone. Quote, I would be willing to shut down government if the Democrats do not give us the votes for border security, which includes the wall. Must get rid of lottery, catch and release, and finally go to system of immigration based on merit. We need great people coming into our country. So this throws a lot of Republicans into a dizzying kind of disarray because, they're just trying to hold on to their jobs. And I'm sure some of them welcome Trump to a solid red district to help them campaign this year. But he's going to try to campaign for Republicans who may cringe at his effort to help them. And with the centerpiece of Republicans' agenda being to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, well, even a numbnut like Tom Cole, Congressman, Republican of Oklahoma, well, we're going to have a challenging midterm anyway. I don't see how putting the attention on shutting down the government when you control the government is going to help you. So, once again, Trump is out of control. A little bit later, we'll talk about Rudy Giuliani, who's sowing chaos, confusion, and division, and just leaving people scratching their heads about the posture on the Mueller investigation. But our oligarchs have been meeting in Colorado Springs. That would be the Koch network. And as you know, David Koch has stepped down. Charlie, he doesn't like to be called Charlie, Charles, is running the whole show. And they are not happy with Trump. Now, they love their tax cuts. Oh, you can believe the Koch Industries is just delighted to have their tax bill reduced. But 500 donors to the Koch network at a meeting in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains sent signals that they're not happy. They're repeatedly stressing that they're going to be more selective about the Republicans they support. They'll withhold support and even attack Republicans who are doing little to stand up to the president when he acts against their conservative ideology. And maybe they're just bummed because their wholly owned subsidiary, Scott Pruitt, got booted out of the government, and another politician they own, Chris Kobach, has been somewhat set back in his efforts to manipulate more elections through the cross-check program. Their only investment that I can identify directly is Mike Pompeo, who's now Secretary of State and kind of beyond their reach. So oligarchs aren't happy. Maybe that makes you happy. In addition to breaching his deal with Republican leaders, over the weekend, Trump broke an agreement that his meeting on July 20th with the young publisher of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, was going to be off the record. Well, it was until Trump got out to Twitter. And he said that he and Sulzberger had talked about the vast amounts of fake news being put out by the media and how that fake news has morphed into the phrase enemy of the people. Sad. So Sulzberger decided to respond. He said that he accepted Trump's invitation for the meeting, mainly to raise his concerns about the president's deeply troubling anti-press rhetoric. I told the president directly that I thought his language was not just divisive but increasingly dangerous. I told him that the phrase fake news is untrue and harmful, but I'm more concerned about his labeling journalists the enemy of the people. I warned that this inflammatory language is contributing to a rise in threats against journalists and will lead to violence, and that's particularly a concern overseas. So they've gone back and forth, and it's really just a bunch of noise. But Trump has a hard time keeping his agreements, and he's the guy who's such a great deal maker, right? Remember during the 2016 campaign, Trump said he had a secret plan to end the war in Syria and to vanquish the Islamic State? Well, we've never seen hide nor hair of that, but we are learning about his secret plan to deal with the whatever war, as I call it, in Afghanistan. Now it's 17 years and counting. The U.S. occupation is not going well. And we learned that last year, the secret part of Trump's plan was to order our military forces and the Afghans that we continue to train, back to the garrisons. And essentially, this was an American-led retreat to the cities, and this leaves the sprawling rural areas of Afghanistan ripe for Taliban, and I guess the Islamic State has some flagged units there now. At any rate, this is somewhat inevitable, but it is not generally considered a front-page story. And Trump has given orders to American diplomats that they are permitted to have face-to-face talks with Taliban representatives at their little outpost in Doha, Qatar. So some talks are underway, and what I'd like to see is a real sea change in Afghanistan with a withdrawal of U.S. troops and a complete turnover. But of course, the Kabul government is not very stable and has never been able to control the entire country. Still, I think that it's a lost cause, and we should exit the graveyard of empires sooner than later. On Friday, I mentioned that Thomas Frank, our friend who has paid off the $5 bet that we made on August 1st of 2016, I said, regrettably, that Trump was going to win and he was sticking with Hillary. Well, on Friday, Thomas Frank said that he's going to stop practicing journalism, end his columns at The Guardian, in order to focus on a couple of book projects. And he ordered us to fix the problem with the Democrats while he is offline. And The Guardian, where he has been columnizing, picked up his book tour in Australia, where they quote Frank as saying Trump is the worst politician ever, but he's on a path to re-election because the Democratic Party refuses to counter his courtship of working-class disaffection. Frank said Trump is his own worst enemy, of course. That news conference with Putin, it's just insane what this guy does. But he could blunder into re-election, hell yeah. And he said the way he would do it is if he were to stop tweeting, keep his mouth shut, and stop picking trade wars, then yes, he could be reelected. That's a pretty tall order there, Tom. Frank said Trump was uniquely dangerous as a political figure, and it requires the left to reconnect with working people to counter the long turn of the American right toward populism. I am absolutely certain, says Frank, that the way for a left party to beat that stuff is not to join it and bid for the bigot vote, but to counter fake populism with the real deal. There's a laborist, workerist populism that has been around for more than 100 years. It's deep in the American grain. It's very popular, but the Democratic Party simply doesn't believe in it anymore. All over the world, left parties forgot why they existed and became parties of the professional class and the innovation economy. They lost their reason for being, and they got whooped. And all around the world, you have these quasi-fascist movements springing up, which is quite alarming. Interesting comments from Tom Frank. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I want to thank some of the folks in New England who have reached out, and we're going to grab a bite to eat while I'm on vacation. I also want to mention Andrew Harnack, Susan Lundgren, Jason Ferguson, and Peter Hoffmeister. They kick in $5 or $10 every month to support this, and I would appreciate it if you do too. I'd love to see a dozen new subscribers while I'm away. Yeah, I would. So visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, click on it, then click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page where your choices are clear, $5, $10, $20 a month. The $50 annual subscription is available. I've got these rock and roll CDs, a bonus gift from John Dist, to send to you with a new $50 annual subscription and a mailing address in the continental U.S. I thank you for your support. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that Rudy 9/11 Giuliani is really kind of off the rails. And a columnist, Aaron Blake at the Washington Post, notes how Rudy keeps moving the goalposts. And that this morning, just in a couple of TV appearances, he kind of changed the tune. So first, of course, he says that there hasn't been any collusion. Then he says collusion isn't a crime. Then he says hacking is the crime. The president didn't hack. He didn't pay for the hacking. Then he said that Trump might sit down with Robert Mueller, and then he said, no, there's no way that'll happen. On the Manafort trial, which is starting tomorrow, at least one of the trials, Giuliani says, Paul Manafort has no information incriminating of the president. I know that for a fact. Now, let's be fair. The Manafort trials are not about anything to do with Russia. They're about Manafort's personal crimes, financial crimes, failing to report as a foreign agent, that sort of thing. So Giuliani is sowing discord and confusion, and I thought that's what the Russians were supposed to be doing. They also repeatedly are sliming Michael Cohen as a liar. And I'm sure he lied a lot when he worked for Trump. So I'm in no position to defend Michael Cohen. But from what we know, these tapes are not lies. The information that Trump knew about the Trump Tower meeting with Veselnitskaya and the other Ruskies doesn't seem to be a lie. So it does appear that character assassination is in the quiver of Rudy Giuliani these days. Ahed Tamimi is free, along with her mother, the Palestinian teenager who turned 17 during the 8 months in custody by the State of Israel, was released. The two of them were released yesterday. And there's some really good quotes in The Guardian from Ahed Tamimi. God willing, I will manage to study law, she said. I will present the violations against the Palestinians in criminal courts and to try Israel for it and to be a big lawyer and to return rights to my country. She said that while in prison, she and the female other prisoners with her there would sit for hours and study legal texts. We managed to transform the jail into a school, she said. And, of course, she's the one who slapped an Israeli soldier. And it is so disproportionate to say that her action, which was an emotional response to the shooting of her cousin in the face by an Israeli soldier, 8 months in prison, this really shows the oppression of the State of Israel. She said, for example, I was under interrogation. There were violations against me. International law says it shouldn't happen to me. And so she has determined that she's going to study the law. She said, her international recognition has infuriated the Israeli government. She said they are afraid of the truth. If they were not wrong, they would not be afraid of the truth. The truth scares them. And I managed to deliver this truth to the world. And of course, they're afraid how far I reached. They always fear the truth. They are the occupier, and we are under occupation. And one more quote, I'm not the victim of the occupation, Ahed said. The Jew or the settler child who carries a rifle at the age of 15, they are the victims of the occupation. For me, I am capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. But not him. His view is clouded. His heart is filled with hatred and scorn against the Palestinians. He is the victim, not me. I always say I am a freedom fighter, so I will not be the victim. And there's a touching personal account of a meeting with the Tamimi family that Ray McGovern had on a recent visit to the West Bank. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. It's over at Consortium News. Also linking to Jonathan Ophir's commentary on the case of Ahed Tamimi. He, of course, is the Israeli expatriate. He writes for Mondo Weiss, and he has been interviewed on this podcast once. He says the attention afforded to Ahed has also a diametrically opposite side, where she's become a target for incitement by Israeli ultranationalists. And earlier this year, her town woke up to Hebrew graffiti splashed around the village, some of which read, "Death to Ahed Tamimi," and "There's no place in this world for Ahed Tamimi." Another sign read, "Death to Ahed Tamimi." So she does have to be concerned about Israeli vigilantes who might try to silence her. So, and just a quick recap from Ophir. There are currently 6,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. Nearly 300 of them are children, and about 450 are on administrative detention, meaning they're being held without charge. Also, Israel, as expected, interdicted the latest Gaza Freedom Flotilla. Yesterday in international waters, they continued their annual violations of the rights of passage of these individuals. They are generally foreign peace activists. There's some journalists on the boat, and there are a couple of Israelis as well. So 2 people from the ship called the Al-Awda, A-W-D-A, have been released, but most of the crew and participants are still in detention at the Givon prison in Israel. The supporters say they are gravely concerned for their safety. We continue to demand that the boat and medical supplies reach their rightful recipients, Palestinian civil society in Gaza. And the Israeli authorities said that the interception of the vessel happened without exceptional incident. But people on board were tasered and hit by masked IDF soldiers. They did not get their passports or belongings before they got off the boat. Do not believe reports of peaceful interception. And I am really struck by the model that Ahed Tamimi sets. And we have parallels in American history, recent American history. There are some Black Panthers still in prison in the United States approaching 50 years after they were convicted, many of them falsely convicted. And I want to credit The Guardian. I often criticize the British-based newspaper for its tainted and biased reporting, particularly on Ukraine, on Russiagate, and many issues. But they do tremendous enterprise journalism here in the United States. And Ed Pilkington has just published a series about the Black Panthers as we approach 50 years. And there's a powerful sidebar about Mumia Abu-Jamal. And Abu-Jamal appeared on a podcast. We weren't able to talk to him live, but he sent recorded messages that we included in a podcast that was released in May or June, along with his co-author, Stephen Vittoria. Abu-Jamal just published this alternate version of American history called Murder Incorporated. So I encourage you to read both the main story about the Black Panthers who are still incarcerated and the sidebar story about Mumia. The Democratic strategy related to the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh appears to have gelled. And you know how they had these different ideas about what they were going to try to do, but in the minority, the best you can do is gum it to death and run out the clock. And so Dianne Feinstein, senator from here in California, is leading the effort to require Kavanaugh's supporters to cough up every document that he handled while he was working as the staff secretary in the W. Bush White House from 2003 to 2006. Now, this could be, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages. And this could take a while. And that appears to be the goal of the Democrats. They are hoping to try to delay a vote on confirmation until after the midterm elections. And certainly the Republicans are going to put up a big fight. And because they have the narrow majority in the Senate, they will fight hard. But we'll see how much juice the Democrats have. By the way, Rand Paul, who had threatened not to support Brett Kavanaugh, he's on board. Interesting story in today's New York Times related to the trial of Paul Manafort that starts tomorrow in Virginia. And they report that Alan Friedman is Italy's professional American. He's a former journalist. He's got a TV show there. And he was recruited by Manafort to create what was called the Habsburg Group. And these were retired European leaders who were paid by Manafort to support Viktor Yanukovych, the leader of Ukraine, who paid Manafort millions of dollars as a political consultant. And as you know, Paul Manafort ended up losing his bail and the ankle bracelet and being locked up in prison before trial because he had used the encrypted communication system WhatsApp to try to signal to Alan Friedman, essentially to coach him on whatever testimony he may give to the trial. And in particular, he was reminding his people that they never did anything in the United States, right? And, of course, Alan Friedman didn't register as a foreign agent, and neither did Paul Manafort, and that could end up being a convictable offense for Manafort. As I get ready to submit to Airport Theater, that's the security system, tomorrow as we head out on vacation, I learn about the new program that federal air marshals have been running for years. It's called Quiet Skies, and they identify passengers who raise flags because of travel histories or other factors, including behavior as common as sweating heavily or using the restroom repeatedly. The program uses travel records and other information to identify passengers for scrutiny, and then there's a checklist that the air marshal uses. Did he or she sleep during the flight? Did they use a cell phone? Did they look around erratically? And if there's no problem when you get off the plane, you're not notified that you were under monitoring by an air marshal. And over at the ACLU, Hugh Handyside says such surveillance not only makes no sense, it's a big waste of taxpayer money and raises a number of constitutional questions. These concerns and the need for transparency are all the more acute because of TSA's track record of using unreliable and unscientific techniques to screen and monitor travelers who have done nothing wrong. And we learn now about AT&T's exclusive control of a new broadband superhighway that is available only to law enforcement agencies. It's called FirstNet, and it apparently surfaces as a recommendation from the 9/11 Commission that took years to enact. FirstNet, run by AT&T, will help agencies like U.S. Customs and Border Protection communicate with local police, deliver more information to officers' hands, accelerate the national law enforcement app industry, and provide public safety agencies with new privileges and powers. Doesn't that make you feel great? They're also going to be moving onto these networks that are no longer over the air, which means that local news and police junkies can't monitor the police radios, or at least not this subset of police communications. And it's part of the vertical integration of law enforcement that's happened since 9/11. It includes the fusion centers and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and you can expect mission creep. Your humble host predicts. They tell us that this is about fighting terrorism, and in the end, it will be used on a whole range of surveillance and investigation operations. A young girl named Yancy Perez Chavez, who's about 5 years old, came across the border with her father, Hugo Perez. They're from Guatemala. And Hugo was picked up by American officials, and he signed some papers that he was told, would allow him to be deported with his daughter. He said his daughter and he had been apprehended by Border Patrol officers in Arizona May 12th, separated the next day. After that, discussions began about accepting what is known as expedited removal back to Guatemala. Lawyers at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, which is representing the daughter, Yancy, said they had also received assurances from officials at the Office of Refugee Resettlement that they would be reunited and deported together. And Well, an offer was made, but the promise was not kept. And this is all a result of Jeff Sessions and Don Trump's misguided and reprehensible zero-tolerance program. And my final word here today is to commend to you an op-ed written by Emily Yoffe. It appeared in Friday's New York Times. I've linked to it. Yoffe is a contributing editor at The Atlantic and writes for HuffPost. And she offers zero tolerance for zero tolerance. And I agree. This started in the war on some drugs, and it has expanded, and it's never been a rational policy that produces rational outcomes. She writes, zero tolerance wasn't just part of the criminal justice system. Under federal mandate, it became entrenched in schools. Among those caught was a 14-year-old girl in Ohio who gave a Midol tablet to a friend for menstrual cramps. And so this zero tolerance has kind of, spread in so many directions. And I abhor it. Her final comment here, to prevent such future injustices and to address the many continuing ones, we should adopt a new approach. Zero tolerance for zero tolerance. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. As I mentioned, we'll be resuming sometime, we hope, in the third week of August. I do have a couple of bonus interviews that I'll be posting over the time that I'm away. One is with Spencer Christian. He was once the weatherman and a personality on Good Morning America. He now forecasts for Channel 7 here in San Francisco. And his new memoir, which describes his battles with gambling addiction, is very powerful. And that's in an interview. You'll hear the audio from a video interview I did with Spencer here on local television in Marin County, California. The other interview is with Ray Lutz, Mary Beth Brangen, and Jim Heddle. They're all activists who have covered the issues related to the shutdown of the San Onofre nuclear power plant here in California, how the cost is being, they tried to jam it on the ratepayers, and there was some relief from that. But the other big issue is what to do with the spent fuel and the nuclear waste. That'll be aired out in the interview, and we'll get that to you in the coming days. In the meantime, maintain your independent thinking and your critical views. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.